The making of sweeping changes to story structure. Hi, today we're going to talk about story structure, how a story starts, how it progresses, and how it ends. There are different ways to do a story. You can do it 1 act, 2 act, or 3 acts. Most scripts for movies are done in 3 acts. To do that, they do the first act is about 30 minutes, then the second act is another 30 and another 30. So page 30 is when you start the second act, and then something else happens at page 60 to start the ending act, which goes to about page 90. In the beginning of the story, there's oftentimes what they call an inciting incident. Something happens, and that progresses the story or gets the story started. And then around page 30, another sort of inciting thing happens again, and then it progresses in a different direction oftentimes. And the same thing around page 60. So a good way of looking at this is looking at old stories, such as the fables and such, that would go, once upon a time something was going on. Once upon a time there was a prince or there was a princess, etc. And then something happened. That is the inciting incident, and that starts the story. Oftentimes you want to actually create the environment that your story is going to be in. For example, if you say, once upon a time there was a prince and a princess who owned this kingdom, you've just described what it's all about. The same thing happens when you tell a joke. 2 men walk into a bar, you've described something. You know, a piece of string walks up to a bartender and says, "Can I have a drink?" And you've described that a piece of string can actually talk. I mean, that's part of the joke. Or you say that a duck walks into a bar, a duck walks, up to a guy and says something. You've described an environment where a duck can talk. And then your story progresses from there. This is oftentimes a very difficult thing to do in storytelling because it seems to be a lot of background stuff that people just don't care about. If you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of my favorite movies, you'll see in that one they have the first scene as kind of an inciting incident itself. He goes out and he finds this artifact and he tries to get it, and boom, right at the end of having it, it gets stolen out of his hands. And it sets up the whole story, because from that you understand what he does and you understand who the villain is, the guy who stole the artifact from him. And then a little bit later in the story, when he goes back to his college and the government folks come in and talk to him about the Lost Ark, or the Ark of the Covenant, he goes and he explains the whole thing to them, draws it on a drawing board, chalks it out and everything. He's excited about it, and it's a great way to set up the environment, to set up the whole story, and make sure that the audience knows what's going on. Now, there's another technique that they use in Star Wars, for example, and they have a scrolling set of text that sets up the environment. And that says, the Empire did this and the rebels did that, etc., etc. I'm sure you've all seen that. And that's another way of doing it. So he gets that out of the way real quickly and then goes on with the story. Boom, you're into a fight, and then you know who the characters are, everybody's introduced, and the story progresses from there, which is really kind of fun. So there are other ways of telling stories. Now, one I like is Joe Velikovsky, and he does this thing called storyality, and he studied stories. What made the most money? What kind of stories made the most money, and how they were structured. We went through Rocky and Star Wars and My Big Fat Greek Wedding. He went through all of those and said, well, they made a lot of money compared to how much they spent for making the movie. And what was the structure of the story? Oftentimes, a story is going to have a character arc. So the character starts one way, learns something at the end of the movie. But it turns out that most movies that make a lot of money, and actually most fables, for example, or stories that have been around for a long time, that doesn't really happen. The audience oftentimes learns something. Now, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, you could say there's no need for Indiana Jones because the Germans were going to go to that island and do what they're going to do anyway, and they were going to be obliterated. But having Indiana Jones in there, you learn that he doesn't care too much for religion and that sort of stuff. And he learns along the way that this artifact is very valuable, and it actually has some religious significance and some power to it. And at the end, when he is at the island, he's tied up with Mary, and he says, "Close your eyes," because he realizes that the power of God is happening. So he does have somewhat of a character arc. But Rocky and other characters don't have much of an arc, but the audience learns something. And that's why fables are actually very good. And that's kind of the point of it. So the story sometimes should tell you something, and sometimes it's done with a character arc, and sometimes the character has no arc, but the audience has an arc. They have a learning process. So keep that in mind when you're writing your stories. I know it's a lot to think about, and it seems kind of overwhelming, but it's okay to do that. And back to Joe now with his storyality. He also says that, you know, the story progresses and has timetables that are smaller than what they have in the 3-act process. And he maps all that out. So if you go to his website for Storyality, you'll see how it gets mapped out, the return on investment kind of discussion, and how the structure of the story progresses, and it gets more intense and more intense as it goes on. You'd see that in most of those big stories like Rocky and that sort of thing. The fight gets more intense and that sort of stuff. And you know, it's a great way of putting that together. And I'm going to use that and those insights to put into my top secret sweeping changes too, that I'm going to reveal a little bit later. But I use those techniques and I put that into the story in order to make the story more interesting and to make it progress fairly quickly within the 6 or 7 pages that I have written for it. So thanks for watching, and I hope you start writing your scripts very soon.